She showed me the way. There were voices.
Upon his inauguration in 1969, Nixon inherited a recession. If you don't know who Nixon is, I'll pull a picture right here. From Lyndon Johnson, who had simultaneously spent generously on the Great Society and on the Vietnam War. Congress, despite some protests, went along with Nixon and continued to fund the war and increase social welfare and spending. And in 1972, for example, both Congress and Nixon agreed to the big expansion of Social Security just in time for the election. Nixon's defects were also making dollar holders abroad nervous. There was a run for the dollar, which many foreigners and Americans thought were overvalued. Soon they were proved right. In 1971, Nixon broke the last link to gold, turning the American dollar into a fiat currency. The dollar was devalued, and millions of foreigners holding dollars, including Arab oil barons with tens of millions of petrodollars, saw the value of the dollar slashed. In the winters of 1972 and 73, Burns began to worry about inflation. In 1973, inflation more than doubled to 8.8%. Later in the decade, it would go to 12%. By 1980, inflation was at a big 14%. In the meantime, the U.S. would endure jobless numbers that exceeded 10%. Millions of Americans were angry by the late 1970s and early 1980s. The 1973-75 recession, or the 1970s recession, was a period of economic stagnation in much of the Western World War during the 1970s. Putting an end to the overall post-World War II economic expansion, it differed from many previous recessions by being a stagflation where high unemployment and high inflation existed simultaneously. Among one of the causes were the 1973 oil crisis and the fall of Bretton Woods-Nixon's shock. The emergence of newly industrialized countries increased. Competition in the metal industry triggered the steel crisis, where industrial core areas in North America and in Europe were forced to restructure. The 1973-74 stock market crash made the recession evident. The major influence of the experience of the 1974 recession came in the form of the concept of stagflation, that is, inflation during a period of recession. The Federal Reserve, as a result, adjusted its to mandate in believing that the inflation-unemployment trade-off was much higher than previously thought, established a 6% target as full unemployment. Thus, unemployment had not reached a peak of 9%. In May of 1975, did not dip below 6% until June 1978. The pre-1974 recession level of 4.6% unemployment was not reached again until November 1997. Now, to put this all in perspective, let's go to oil. The oil embargo of 73 and 74 which pushed prices of petroleum for $15 to $45 a barrel, almost overnight, certainly contributed to inflationary measures during this period, taking a larger share of incomes. At times of falling consumer spending, the price of petroleum products continued to rise, with some momentarily leveling throughout the decade, reaching a peak of $73 a barrel.
There were a lot of trouble going on in the streets that involved gangs and drugs. These were popular issues increasing in the United States. A lot of gangs were causing troubles in the community, the authorities, and with other gang members. Since a lot of gang members from other countries gang were starting to create was because of the reasons that people were migrating to the United States because of issues in their own countries. This started a lot of issues because they had different beliefs in like how things should be run. So a lot of gangs were just in the streets, such as like shootings and starting gangs just created a big issue. And with a lot of gangs, this also involved drugs. This was an issue because even teenagers were doing drugs in high schools. For example, and 48% of Americans told Gallup that drugs was a serious problem in their community, which doubled up later on in the years. A lot of teenagers said that they admitted to taking marijuana and other type of drugs, and drugs was a big influence that did damage to like their brains and caused them to want to join gang members. So gangs were increasing in the 1970s, but There was a law passed in the 1970s about the drug usage, and Congress enacted the Controlled Substance Act. Which tried to decrease the amount of drugs that was used. So this law didn't really work as much because drugs were still popular even to this day. People were like sneaking in, and that's where like drug dealers were being popular and doing business behind people's backs. And well, gangs and drugs was one of the big issues back in the 1970s, causing many problems in the United States, and it just started to getting even worse and worse.
During the 1970s, a lot of classic TV shows and movies came out. Scooby-Doo, Where Are You? 1969 through 1970. Scooby-Doo follows 4 teenagers named Velma, Daphne, Fred, Shaggy, and their talking Great Dane Scooby-Doo as they go around solving mysteries in their blue and green van called the Mystery Shack. The Brady Bunch, 1969 through 1974. The Brady Bunch is about divorced Michael Brady remarrying divorced Carol Ann Martin. His 3 boys join her 3 girls for a total of 6 children. Along with her dog named Tiger and a housekeeper named Alice Nelson, they go on adventures together. They also go through struggles that any family does. The Muppet Show, 1976 through 1981. The Muppet Show is a comedy television show that follows Kermit the Frog as he attempts to run a variety show in the Muppet Theater. Jaws, 1975. Jaws follows Mayor Larry Vaughn, ichthyologist Matt Hooper, and ship Captain Quint to help capture a shark who killed a young woman who was skinny dipping on the coast of a tourist town. Rocky, 1976. Rocky is about a small-time boxer named Rocky Balboa who is chosen to take on the reigning world heavyweight champion Apollo Creed because his original opponent got injured. Star Wars, 1977. Star Wars is about the Imperial forces who are under order from Darth Vader, holding Princess Leia hostage in an attempt to end the rebellion against the Galactic Empire. Luke Skywalker, Han Solo, R2-D2, and C-3PO work together to rescue the princess and restore freedom and justice in their galaxy. Incredible Hulk, 1977 through 1982. The Incredible Hulk is about scientist Bruce Banner looking for a cure for the gamma radiation that contaminated his cells, turning him into the Hulk. Grease, 1978. Grease is a musical that follows the friendship and adventures of high school students back in the 50s. Even though it's about the 50s, it came out in 1978. That 70s Show. That 70s Show follows 17-year-old Eric Foreman and his friends as they grew up together in the 1970s. This show is about the 70s, although it came out in 1998.
The French designer and the American designer Huston both observed and embraced the changes that were happening in the society, especially the huge growth of women's rights and the youth counterculture. They successfully adapted their design aesthetics to accommodate the changes that the market was aiming for. The top fashion models in the 1970s were Lauren Huddy, Beverly Johnson, Gia Karanji, Doreen Stixon, Jerry Hall, and Eamon. The early 1970s fashion included tie-dye t-shirts, Hungarian blouses, pouches, capes, and military surplus clothing. Bottom attire for women during this time included bell-bottoms, gouges, frayed jeans, midi skirts, and ankle-length maxi dresses. New technologies brought advances to reduction through mass production, higher efficiency, and generating higher standards and uniformity. Generally, the most famous fashion in the mid and late 1970s for both genders was that of the tight on top and loose at the bottom. The 1970s also saw the birth of indifferent. So, technically, it's safe to say that the 1970s fashion was the best fashion.
Many people believe the 70s were the best decade in terms of music. In the 70s, many different things were happening, such as the Vietnam War or the racial tensions still being a problem. These topics had a very big impact on the music in the 70s. Even drugs had an important impact on the music during the decade. Songs that talked or expressed their feelings about these events and topics were included in many different genres of music. All artists had an opinion on these particular subjects. Aside from disco, funk, smooth jazz, jazz fusion, and soul remained popular throughout the decade. It is this influx of popular music that transformed into rock and roll during the early 1970s. Rock music played an important part in the Western musical scene, with punk rock thriving throughout the mid to late 1970s. Other subgenres of rock, mainly glam rock, hard rock, progressive, art rock, and heavy metal, achieved various amounts of success. Other genres, such as reggae, were innovative throughout this decade and grew a significant following. Hip-hop emerged during this decade, but was slow to start and did not become significant until the late 1980s. Many may think about disco music when they think of 70s music, but many of the most well-known rock bands, such as Pink Floyd, Led Zeppelin, Lynyrd Skynyrd, the Eagles, and Queen, came from the 70s. There are also individual artists that shine by themselves, such as Elton John, Bruce Springsteen, or David Bowie. These artists by themselves were iconic and made a huge impact in shaping the general idea of 70s music as a whole. These bands and artists blew up and would draw hundreds and thousands of people to fill stadiums. For example, the Isle of Wight festival that took place August 26th to the 31st, 1970. This festival had up to 600 to 700,000 people at it. There was also the rise of R&B, soul, that influenced the 70s. In the 1970s, African Americans shifted away from genres like rock and blues, which had originally been invented and dominated by black musicians. While blues performers like B.B. King and Albert King remained successful, they changed to mostly white audiences. Soul, R&B, and funk became the predominant music style among black artists and audiences. Artists from this genre include people such as Stevie Wonder, Al Green, and James Brown. During the 1960s and 70s, disco music became popular internationally. Disco music is meant to be danced or to entice listeners to get up and dance. Popular disco artists include the Bee Gees, Grace Jones, and Diana Ross. Disco in the 70s was a reaction against the rock genre that was popular at the time. To freely dance was an important part of disco culture. Now, iconic dances that come from the disco movement include the YMCA, the hustle, and the bump.